So today we're going to talk about things that I do that are practical inside Maya that help me optimize my workflow when I am beginning a shot. So first of all, imagine I want to do this little shot that is based on Sully doing this kind of action, Monster Inc. in the first movie. So the first thing I would do is, this is a Pro Rigs rig, and they're really cool rigs. So if I were to reference in a rig, so first, not importing a rig. Why? Because when you import a rig or when you open the rig file, then if the rig for some reason has any bugs or modifications done to it, then you can't change it anymore because it's in your shot. But if you reference in your rig, you can always right click and say reference and replace reference. And you can always change it to a new path, and it will work if the rig has any sort of new features or if you add a new feature. One thing that I do a lot as a lead is that sometimes the client would send rigs and we need to modify them somehow. So I would open the file, the base file of the rig, just like I click on the Maya file and I open that. And there I do all the modifications, and then I save the file with the same name. And if I need to open it in another Maya, what I do is I just open a brand new file and I reference in that rig that I created. But I never work on that base file, just so we can do anything with the new rigs that you have, any updates that you may have. So that's the first tip. Always reference in your rigs. That makes everything easier. Second tip, some rigs and some projects, mostly when you're working already in a production basis, have different coordinates. And this happens a lot when you have different clients, or if you're working freelance, because not everything's going to be consistent. Usually when you're in a studio that has everything sorted out and it's the same pipeline because it's internal of your studio, like Pixar or DreamWorks, they have their own software and their own rigs and they create everything internally. So you won't run into this kind of trouble. But if you are working for other companies like, I don't know, Milfilm, MPC, Mr. X, Micros, all of those are in the Technicolor umbrella, or any other studio, you're doing things that are of your own that could work with other vendors, you're always going to have to adapt to other sorts of clients, and it's interesting. So one thing that you need to do is go into your preferences, and inside your settings you need to just change the up axis. So that will make for everything to be vertical. This is the default one, but for some projects you have to work in Z. And that's the way everything is set up. So I just like to check that my grid is there and my character's facing forward, And sometimes you also need to go view and say view along axis. And so what this will do is you can change the axis in which your perspective or your current camera is gonna toggle on. And you will see that there are some that are whack and that you just see this and you can't rotate it. It's frustrating. And sometimes people don't know why that happens. And there's not a lot of documentation online as to why that happens. And this is the thing that fixes it. So just check. For example, this would be -Z, works perfectly for me right now because I see the character facing me, and my camera seems to toggle nicely, and so that's really important. So that's the second tip, just checking that everything's aligned. And because some characters work on a different axis, sometimes this is not going to be translation Y, and this is not going to be translation C, but this is going to be, for example, translation Z, and it's a little confusing. So you also need to adapt regarding what project you're working on to understand your curves, because your curves, if you're used to having the green being up and down as it should be, sometimes that will change. So that's a little note just to keep in mind, that I really like. And another tip would be to really check your spaces. So I usually like, if my character is just doing arm gestures or just moving, dancing, doing anything like that, I always like to keep it in FK. So some rigs have the FK control here, but some others don't. This one doesn't, for example. It just has twist, auto stretch, pull vector, but it doesn't really have IK here. So in this rig, it lives in this little box. And you go here and you switch it. So now it's FK. So if I switch it, now it's in FK. So this must sound simple, but sometimes as an animator, you can be like, for a long time, just trying to figure out what control is moving or where to get, I find that little space switcher or that switch. So that's a good tip. Another thing I always like to do is that, for example, if I rotate this, these arms are not rotating with my character. This is like this default, but usually what you would see is that the arms are like this. They're following the chest. And unless your character is doing something like this, or is doing something where you want him to spin and doing like exactly that, then you normally don't want that. You normally, for a cleaner motion, you want the arms to be in world, because that means that you will get a more organic sort of feel when you are doing it kind of like that, because your arms wouldn't perfectly move one-to-one with your torso, or you would look very robotic. So before I even start setting any keys, I really try to figure out what I want to do. If my character is gonna spin, I try to see if I can get away with only rotating this and not rotating the feet and then the cog and then the arms and all of that. Simplifying my life and making it as easier as possible before I even go into it. And with that, another very important thing is having the head in world as well, because we want that head to remain stable. No matter how much your body moves, your head is almost always gonna counter that like a chicken, like a chicken head, and stay in the same spot. And your body can move a lot, but your head usually doesn't. So unless you really want your head to be following all your body, which is not very common, I would recommend to always keep it in world. Then there are other things like your knees and what they're following. That really varies on, it's very case driven. I sometimes like when they're driven by my feet. So if I rotate the foot, the knee is gonna follow. One thing that I see junior animators do all the time that looks wrong is when they, for example, have, let's say this character's a little bit like this, and their knee is like, let's say this is 0. So a lot of people do this, or tend to have the knee not pointing where the foot is pointing. In this case, like, this looks broken because it's a little too flexed. But what I mean is, if you do an action, your knee and your foot are almost always going to be consistently pointing in the same direction. You rarely get like a knee that's pointing another way. So check your rig and check what spaces it offers to have that knee. If you can like automate it a little so that it follows the foot, then you're gonna just need to worry about the foot placement and not so much about the knee, and then the knee you can clean it and polish it. Another important thing is to figure out if your rig has little noodle controls, because in the polish phase that's going to be super important and easy to just mess around with this. Most rigs, there's a point where if you're stretching them, the knees get locked, so tuk, and you see like the knee going like that and having a little pop. And so sometimes there's no fix to that other than really when you're in the polishing phase, clicking on these guys and just frame by frame the areas that are dirty and just like click on different keys. Oh, it's launching Animbot. Click on different keys and then going in and really making sure that the knee is consistent so that you don't have any dirt there in every single view. And that's something that helps a lot in polish. So all these little controls are very important, but I wouldn't recommend to overuse the noodle controls because yeah, they will help you get better shapes overall, but they can also make everything dirty and very hard to clean up. So at the beginning, just like focus on the main things and don't worry too much about these other things. And this is more like of a polish thing that you can address, unless the shapes of your rig are really messed up and then you have to use them as soon as possible to get those shapes looking better. Okay, another quick tip. Not a lot of people use this, and I don't know why, because it's such a useful tool, but a lot of people just don't know it. So, for example, if I'm doing this animation, which is very simple, I don't have many keys, it's still rough blocking. If I grab this, I can change the timing by using this tool that I haven't seen a lot of people use. It's like multiple retime markers. So what this allows us to do is we can, for example, say this is taking too little. I want this anticipation of him going down, this time that he spends here before he goes up, to be a little longer. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna double click here, like a frame prior, like around here, and then like double click here on a frame after, and then scale it. I just click and drag it. And so what this does is it will deform whatever is inside the section, but not whatever is inside this section or this section, but it will translate it to whatever you want in the timeline. So it's literally like grabbing a piece of material and stretching it at different areas. Now, that is if I don't want any of this to stretch out at all. But if I do, if I want some, like only all this area to be affected, but I want this area, for example, all this area to scale and be longer, but this area to be shorter consistently, what I would do is only use this one and click and drag it. And so this area will get smaller, but this is not affected unless I grab this and move this. This is a tool that like my fellow animators here sometimes at the studio don't know about. Like sometimes I am with senior animators, supervisors, and they just don't know this tool. I don't know why, it just gets hidden here. A lot of people use this one, which I don't necessarily love. I don't use it all the time, or this one, but I love this one. This one's my cup of tea. And sometimes you have a lot of stuff going on, and when you have a lot of keys, sometimes what you can do is stop the display in Animbot, or say, for example, you really know that you want to clean this up, but Maya takes a very long time because Maya wants to give you all the resources so you can watch what you're doing. But sometimes that's not necessary for you and you would just like to not see the things that are happening. You can go to show, no, you can go to view, and then, no, in your panels, you can just choose another thing that's not your viewport. You can choose, for example, dope sheet. And this is not going to give you a lot of information. So when you move this, your viewport is not going to be refreshing. And you're going to, without any tools, without relying on any external resources, going to be able to align things, move things around, and then you can just go back to your camera. Okay, so those were some quick and simple tricks that I use a lot. On the next talk, I want to talk to you guys about how I set up a camera. Really quick, dirty, cheap, easy, fast for you. Just how to have a camera that looks appealing right away, that makes sense for whatever you're doing in your scene, and that has the proper attributes that you want before you get into your shot. And because sometimes you have to change other things, or change focal length, or change the angular of aperture, or things like that will just mess with your entire shot because you've already started to animate something. So these are kind of like basic tips when you are just starting to block things out. But yeah, those are some things that I use all the time. And let me know if you have any questions, and I would love to share more stuff with you. What do you think, Sunny?
That was awesome.
Cool.
How did you so I saw you activated the tool and you added those sort of markers, but then you added a third one in the middle to like retime those areas. How did you add this middle thing?
You only double click.
Oh, okay.
So it's really
double click.
Yeah, let me show you real quick. So say I have this is the other the other picker for the other shot. Say I have this select all. And so I have a hotkey for my graph editor. I can also talk about hotkeys because they're so useful. And I select this thingy, my retimer, and I double click here, I double click here, I double click here, I double click here in the middle, I double click here, whatever I want. And then I just click and drag this, guys.
Okay.
Click and drag this one, and then click and drag this one, for example.
Okay, so the end, the one on the far right will stay there, unless you move it.
Yes, and this one too.
So your boundary stays the same, and then you can just adjust whatever you have in the middle.
Yes. So it's really useful, and whatever, and you can also double click on them to eliminate them, or just select something else and start working with. I just said W in my keyboard just to like get out of that mode, and if I go back, I can always like add more controls to it, or more retimer markers. And it can be just one, this would literally just move everything. But usually you want, 2 or more, so you can scale one part without losing everything. And every time you do it, just make sure that you pull your time to where it should be, so that you don't lose the ending of your animation. But that's pretty logical.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
Because it's moving everything, so just make sure that aligns with whatever you have changed.
The ending of the animation is like at whatever frame, and you're moving your animation with that one.
Yeah.
And if you go beyond that, will it cut it? Or will
yes.
It's cutting.
Yeah, because your frame rate or your frame range is remaining in the same place. So you have 1 to 30, for example, 30 frames. And if you make it longer, your animation will go further. But you just have to, in your timeline, say, okay, I don't want it to cut at 30, I want it to cut now at 60. And you just extend it, and then you can see all your animation. So it's not really eliminating everything, it's just like shifting it more towards the right.
Outside of the actual frame range, and then I just have to make sure that I have my entire range again displayed.
Yeah, you got it. So it's only that, and it's so useful. I use it all the time, and it's one of my favorite retiming things.
There are for this one.
Yeah, my pleasure. And this is recorded, and also whoever wants to check it out, this is for my Patreon community, so they can all access it. So don't worry if you didn't take enough notes, you can always go back to the recording. And any other questions regarding those things?
Regarding up access, I was wondering, you changed that in the preferences.
Yes.
So what happens if you open now a rig that has, again, the other up access?
You do the same thing. You do both things. You go here and you change it back to in settings. Your preferences, you just change it back to Y. And that's okay. It doesn't change much. It just changes the whole way of visualizing everything. So, but it doesn't really change your curves.
Okay.
So,
And about
yeah.
you mentioned understanding your curves. I've noticed that with a lot of rigs where the upper axis or the y-axis, whatever, is not the actual movement that I'm doing. So when I remove a control, I see something completely different in the channel box.
Yeah, we can talk about it because I feel I'm gonna write it down for our next meeting. Yeah, sometimes it has to do with the gimbal. And if you're moving things in 3D, sometimes your gizmo and your controls are not portraying things that are actually what is reflected in your graph editor. So you just have to go and mess with the settings there, with the settings of your move tool or your rotate tool, and then it will give you exactly what you'll see in your graph editor. So I can show you how to do that, and that's something really useful. It's something I learned some years in the industry, and I wish I'd known sooner. So yeah, we will talk about that, definitely.
I just remember a few times where it completely confused me because I saw something completely different in the graph editor.
Yeah.
Mine just, I don't know, I just went offline.
Definitely. That happens all the time. So
yeah.
do you have any more questions, or would you like me to stop recording and then just chat a little bit?
I think that's it.
Yeah, cool. If anyone has questions, guys, any of my patrons, just send me a little message and I will be helping you with that. Cheers.